Hello, folks, and welcome to the second to last lecture in American Literature 2. This is a very brief introduction to our second to last text, Maia Kobabe's Gender Queer, a graphic memoir. So unlike a lot of other lectures, which were more kind of overviews of periods of literary history or aesthetic movements, this is an introduction to one particular book um, that we are reading together. Okay, so I want to start by looking at why we're studying this book. And the answer is that Kobabe's Genderqueer was the most challenged book in the United States for 3 years in a row with 2021, 2022, and 2023, according to the American Library Association. That means that the ALA tracks how many complaints or challenges are made about specific titles in libraries, both public, like municipality libraries and school libraries around the country, and tallies up which titles get challenged the most. And for 3 years in a row, it was genderqueer. So if you Google it, you'll see like the tagline "most banned book in America." Yeah, in some ways, you can call this the most banned book in America. Um, and we're finishing at the end of the semester by looking at this book, precisely because we began our semester with Toni Morrison's essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, where she talks about the canon wars and the idea that what is or isn't in the canon, what is or isn't studied as American literature, is an ideological battleground, right? The canon is an ideological battleground. It defines what is American. And that was true for quote unquote older texts, right? Do we include someone like Emily Dickinson in the canon as a woman? Yes. Or no? We fight about that. Is a play like Louis Valdez's Zoot Suit in the canon? What about Angelina Wells Grimke's Rachel, right? Like these texts get debated out whether they should be part of American literature or not. But what we end our semester on is the idea that this is not just a debate about old stuff, but it is a debate that happens to this day about which books we should or shouldn't be read by whom. Right. So we started our semester with Morrison talking about canon wars and fighting over which texts are or aren't worthy of study, which ones are or aren't in the canon. And we end the semester with a book that is frequently being fought over right now in the present, right? So that's kind of like the bookend idea of what we're looking at. The idea that literature is a battleground, right? Um, and in higher education, we study banned books. The beautiful thing about higher ed is because of something called academic freedom, which college instructors have to a much greater degree than K through 12 teachers. Uh, book book bans are things that we can often get around. It would be astronomically difficult to ban books in a college. And so in higher education institutions, we study banned books because some of you might have grown up in a place where you didn't have access to them. But in college and university, we can study those banned books, so we do. Quick reminder as I go through this lecture that Maia Kobabe is a real person, even though Maia is a character in a graphic memoir. And Maia uses em air pronouns. So the example is ask M if E wants sugar in air tea. That is a parallel to the sentence, ask him if he wants sugar in his tea, right? So anytime you would use a pronoun like him or her, you would use M. Anytime you would use a pronoun like he or she, you would use E. And anytime you would use a pronoun like his or her, you would use air, right? I'm going to do my best to do it. I'm really good at they, them, their pronouns because I use they, them, their pronouns as a non-binary person. But even as a queer person who is a scholar of queer theory, I still sometimes fumble with pronouns, but we're all going to do the best job we can in our conversations to use the correct pronouns for Maya during our class conversations. And I'll also say that it is even more important in writing to get someone's pronouns correct because when you're writing, you have the opportunity to go back and edit. So I'll use an example from my own life. When people get my pronouns wrong in a discussion out loud, I'm very understanding about that. But when it's something like a formal work email or an evaluation, performance evaluation, or someone's giving a written introduction of me at an event, because that is written and you can go back and check before you publish or before you hit send or submit, you can check. It is higher level of expectation that you get pronouns right in writing. So we're all going to be very understanding with each other, but we are going to correct each other and make sure we get Maya's pronouns correct. Okay, so then I want to go through some terminology really quickly. This isn't a gender studies class, but I'll put on my hat as co-director of the Gender and Women's Studies program for a second and just go through this list of terms, because I don't want to assume anything about what folks are or aren't familiar with. This isn't like a vocabulary quiz, and I don't expect you to learn all of this. This is a lot of language, but I want to recognize that for those of you for whom you are not familiar already with queer terminology, this book might be confusing because it throws a lot of terms at you. So this is just a quick rundown. Genderqueer, the title, is a term for a gender expression or identity that doesn't fit neatly into another more stable category like man or a woman, which is similar to a term you've probably heard more often, which is non-binary, which refers to a gender expression or identity that rejects the gender binary. Example, your professor, I am non-binary. It's why I use they, them, theirs pronouns. So genderqueer and non-binary folks reject the idea of being either a man or a woman. Now, not all genderqueer and non-binary folks express that in the same way. Some folks choose to be very androgynous and kind of in between. Some folks are more fluid and one day might present hyper masculine or another day hyper feminine. Um, uh, it is different. What they all have in what all these folks have in common, myself included, is the rejection of the kind of binary stable man and woman. Um, the term queer depends on who's using it. Historically, it was an anti-gay slur that folks would call gay, lesbian, queer people as an insult. But it has been reclaimed over the last 5 decades by LGBT folks as an umbrella term for everybody who is outside of the kind of binary norms of men and women and kind of heterosexuality. So anyone who's outside those kind of norms of binary man woman heterosexuality, queer is an umbrella term for a bunch of folks. There are other ways that that term gets used, and in fact, you could take a whole class on that, but I'll stick with that for now. You should know the term assigned sex or assigned gender basically refers to when you are born, when a person is born, the doctor present subjectively kind of evaluates that baby's body parts and makes a determination of that child's gender or sex. And there's a whole lot we can talk about with that, but I'm just going to leave it at the definition for now, and we can talk more about that, or you can ask questions that I can answer in your responses. Transgender and cisgender are important terms. Transgender describes someone whose gender identity does not align with their assigned gender at birth. So if you're assigned male at birth, but you don't identify as a man, you're transgender because your gender identity doesn't align with your assigned gender at birth. Cisgender is a term that describes anyone whose gender identity does align with what they were assigned at birth. So if you were assigned the gender man, or the gender male when you were born, and now as an adult you identify as a man, your gender aligns with what you were assigned, so you are cisgender, right? And cisgender and transgender are completely morally neutral terms. They're neither praise nor critique, right? Calling someone one of those terms isn't saying a good or a bad thing about them. It is simply an adjective. The word lesbian refers to someone who is themselves a woman and who is sexually and or romantically attracted to women. Gay is any person who is sexually and or romantically attracted to people of the same gender as themselves, whatever that means to that person. And then bi and pansexual is a term for people who are sexually and or romantically attracted to many or all genders. Um, within queer communities, people like to fight about bi and pansexual as being these two different terms. A lot of us, especially those of us who are a little bit older, like myself, find that fight um, uh, less interesting. These terms are basically synonyms. Um, some folks might say differently. So just take that with a grain of salt. Asexual refers to a person who, on a spectrum, does not or rarely experiences sexual attraction to anyone. And that term is important because in Genderqueer, the book, Maia expresses potentially being asexual or on the ace spectrum, right? So this is an important term to keep in mind, that some people just genuinely never or extremely rarely ever experience sexual attraction. Um, and then the last term I have on here is really important, the term queer antagonism. It's a less popular term. I'm assuming you've heard most of the other terms that I've named so far out beyond the classroom, just because they're more of a part of pop culture now. Queer antagonism is not, but I am going to use it a lot in class as a term to denote anti-queer violence, policy, and sentiment without the pathologizing language of phobia. Basically, the idea of, you've probably heard homophobia or transphobia. Um, some of us in the queer community, like myself, reject those terms because they basically treat these things like it's fear, and instead use the term antagonism to get at the violence and the kind of oppositional force that what usually gets called homophobia or transphobia is. So when you hear me say queer antagonism, I'm referring to violence, policy, and sentiment that is directed against queer lives. Okay, I'm speeding through because I want this to be a nice, a shorter lecture for you. So just a word about reading comics. When you read a comic, you read from the top left to the bottom right like a Z. So you start in the top left, you read left to right, um, when you get to the end on the right, you go down to the next row on the left and you go across again, and you keep going like that, right? So you start at the top left, you go across, then you go down one row, back to the left and go across, then you go down a row and back to the left and across. That is both true for going from panel to panel and within a panel, within a single panel. So like on the screen right now on this slide, if this was a comic book panel and you were trying to read it, you would start with the bubble with the 3 exclamation points because that's in the top left. You'd read across to the hey, and then you'd go back to the left one row down to that thought bubble, and then go across to the you what, and then to the bottom left corner of the wow, right? So it's starting in the top left and reading across, next row, across, next row, across, whether that's between panels or within a panel. And then just to help you know how to like interpret the markings in a panel, like I'm going to refer to these examples on this kind of free example that I found online. The bubble with the 3 exclamation points, the circle with the attachment to a character, that's a speech bubble. That is a bubble that refers to something a character is saying out loud. Underneath that, the squiggly lines that look like a cloud, where that connects to a character through smaller dots that are also like clouds, that's a thought bubble. That is something that a character thinks but doesn't say out loud. So it's important when you're reading to understand, is the dialogue you're reading, is it in a speech bubble, which means the character actually said it in the scene, or is it in a thought bubble, which means the character only thought it in their head but didn't say it out loud. Um, then if you look underneath that to the wow, that wow with the jagged kind of bubble, that jaggedness is kind of like an exclamation point that is supposed to make you understand that there is emotion in that dialogue, right? And you can tell it's dialogue because of that tail that attaches to a character, right? You can also do the same thing if that tail, instead of a tail, if it was those clouds like the one above it, then it would be a really loud thought instead of a really loud speech, right? So you always want to look at the tail. Is it a tail or is it dots? Tail is going to be dialogue, dots is going to be thoughts. When you see that, hey, you, what? That is trying to express real-time dialogue between two characters. So you can imagine that it would be, hey, you, and then along a similar line to the you would be another character speech bubble saying, I'm over here. And then the what underneath that is a response to the I'm over here. So those linked speech bubbles means that these are linked back and forth in dialogue with another character in the scene. And so I'm just going to go with those elements for now. The other thing that I'll say is a technique that Maia Kobabe does use in genderqueer that I want you to pay attention to is moments where air speech bubbles actually go outside, like have a tail that trails outside of a comic panel, and so the speaker isn't present in the panel. So there are some times where there's a speech bubble, but the tail of the speech bubble doesn't attach to any of the characters drawn on the page, and the character themselves is kept outside of the action, even though their speech is heard. So I just want to signal that that is a thing that Kobabe does, and it's an interesting technique because, again, in this class, we study technique and craft as much as we study content and ideas. And I want you to pay attention to how Kobabe uses that technique as a piece of comic writing craft, right? So look for the moments where there's a speech bubble with a tail, but the tail doesn't connect to a character. The tail goes off the page, right? That's a really important thing to notice. And then we're at the end of the lecture. So your prompts, there are two prompts. I'd like you to answer both if you can, but if you only have time or brain power to answer one, that's okay. Think about like answering one being like a B plus, A minus, and thinking about answering two as like your A level kind of work. So your two prompts are both referring back to Toni Morrison. The first one says, taking our cue from Toni Morrison's guidance that we move past obvious questions, we're not going to spend much time in class on why is genderqueer such a vehemently challenged book. We know why. Queer antagonism, right? It's obvious why the book is banned. We don't have to spend much time debating that. Instead, I want you to consider the question, what are the consequences of banning books like Genderqueer? And in fact, Kobabe addresses this question implicitly within the book itself. So I'd love if some of your responses reference the text when answering that question. And then the second prompt is taking our cue from Toni Morrison's guidance that the answer to why it's valuable to read works by marginalized authors cannot simply be mere diversity, right? Think of that paragraph at the end of the Unspeakable Things Unspoken essay that I said was super important, where Morrison talks about the study of literature being not about tolerance or kind of this like um, uh parental like raising a child or beating a child into submission or like those kind or like being tolerant of your neighbors, right? Like that is not what she's saying. She wants us to study craft and technique and significance of like how the work that a text is doing, not just oh, it's by a diverse author, right? So if we keep that in mind, right, the point of reading Genderqueer can't simply be the very shallow idea that you should be exposed to different kinds of people, right? It is important to learn that queer people exist, obviously, right? Like, obviously, it's important to learn that queer people exist. Obviously, it's important to read experiences that aren't your own, just like it's obviously important for those of you in the class who are not Black to read texts by Black authors. It's obviously important for those of you in the class who are not Chicano to read texts by Chicano authors, right? That's an obvious thing. That's the kind of thing that Toni Morrison would say, like, okay, fine, like we don't have to spend a bunch of time on that. Um, so understanding that, I want you to approach the question, why is it important to study banned books in particular? Right? So Genderqueer is one banned book. Multiple of Toni Morrison's essays are frequently banned. Um, uh, there's a bunch of banned books in this country, right? There's a mostly right-wing politicians and political organizations fight to ban books from schools and from libraries, right? That's just happens to be a matter of fact, right? I'm not trying to put it on one side or the other. That just simply happens to be what the numbers say. Um, so books get banned a lot in this country. That's a fact. The question is, why is it important to study banned books? Right? Why is it that colleges and universities make it a point to teach banned books in our classes? I want you to think about that, and I want you to say something about that. So with that, that is it for the second to last lecture in American Lit 2. I look forward to reading your responses.